We're going to stick to a bit of a fireside chat format today. We will keep it very informal with just some targeted questions to start us off, to set the stage, and to explore some of these topics. And then we will have a discussion with the audience, with you all, take questions, and hopefully dive a little deeper into just some of the things that can be done to address the really dire situation that is facing Afghan women today as we speak. And of course, setting the tone for that, as we all know, since the withdrawal of US and international forces from Afghanistan in 2021, Afghan women and girls have experienced a dramatic backslide of their fundamental rights and freedoms under the extremely repressive rule of the Taliban that continues to get worse day by day. This situation is increasingly being described as gender apartheid. Legal scholars, advocates, human rights experts are demanding that gender apartheid be recognized under international law, as it currently is not. So we're going to explore the lived realities of Afghan women and girls that are being subjected to this situation that we're calling gender apartheid inside the country. It's excluding them from political, economic, and social life. Even just a couple of weeks ago, the latest edict is that women and girls' faces and voices are now banned from public. And we'll talk about how all of this is really undermining the implementation of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. We're going to discuss the necessity and urgency of codifying gender apartheid in international law, and explore where that stands currently. And then talk about maybe what the WPS agenda and community can learn from this moment, especially from the movement to codify gender apartheid and vice versa, especially given just the urgency and the speed at which the movement to push for gender apartheid codification has really taken root. So we have two wonderful speakers to start us off. We have Heather Barr, who is the Interim Women's Rights Deputy Director at Human Rights Watch. She joined Human Rights Watch in 2011 as their Afghanistan researcher. And before that, she worked for the UN in Afghanistan on human rights from 2007 to 2011. So very long history and expertise on Afghanistan. She hasn't lived in Afghanistan since 2014, but has continued visiting regularly and following the situation, continuing to advocate for women and girls. She's a lawyer and has also worked on the rights of women and girls in other countries. We also have, thank you so much, Heather, for being with us today. We also have Mitra Mahan. Mitra is a human rights activist from Afghanistan, recognized as a finalist for the 2021 European Parliament Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought. She has a decade of experience in international development, peace, and gender equality. She has worked with prestigious organizations such as the United Nations, the World Bank, and USAID. She's also co-founder of the Feminine Perspectives Movement and has advocated for women's rights during the inter-Afghan peace negotiations and intergenerational dialogues. Now in exile, unfortunately, due to the Taliban's resurgence, she continues to fight for gender equity. And like I said, I'm the executive director of Mina's List, and we seek to build peaceful and just societies around the world by advancing women's leadership in politics and peace. And we provide resources, tools, and support and training to empower women political leaders and women human rights defenders wherever they are in government and civil society. We advocate for and with them, even if they are displaced from their home countries, with a special focus on Afghanistan currently. So we're going to go ahead and set the stage on exactly what gender apartheid is. So we'll start with you, Mitra, to really kind of give us the background and paint a picture for us on why we are using this term, gender apartheid. What does it mean in practice? What does it mean legally? What are the conditions women are facing today that amount to this? And what are the implications for interpreting this through international crime, such as crime that do exist, such as crimes against humanity, and making it legal officially? And lastly, this is a long question, but lastly, have women within Afghanistan been engaged in discussions around this? So I'll let you go ahead and set the stage for us.
Thank you so much for having me today, and I'm happy to have this this conversation. So when as we speak today, just 2 weeks ago, the Taliban published the regulation for their Minister of Vice and Virtue in our National Gazette that formalized and expanded the atrocities they commit against women in Afghanistan, that criminalized the face and the voice of women. It also ordered that women cannot go out without a male chaperone, and also that this same law subject them to arbitrary detention, torture, and long-term imprisonment as the Taliban deemed necessary. But this specific law is in 114 pages and 35 articles that criminalize almost everything in womanhood inside Afghanistan. But that was maybe something everyone in the room has heard about Afghanistan in the past 2 weeks. But since August 2021, when the Taliban took control of Afghanistan, started oppressing, subjugating women in a very systematic and institutionalized way to ensure the dominance of men in the state, which is the Taliban regime now in Afghanistan, over women. Saying that, it means there are laws that ban, control or restrict women's access to education, employment, freedom of speech, freedom of movement, and even practicing culture and art. As a woman or girl in Afghanistan, you cannot participate in any sport activities, you cannot sing, you cannot play any music instrument. But also, in the meantime, they introduced institutions to violently enforce these draconian laws. First thing they did was abolish the Ministry of Women Affairs and replace it with their Ministry of Vice and Virtue. They dismantled the constitution, the elimination of violence against women law that specifically banned forced marriages and rape, domestic violence, and others, and also including other introduced protection mechanisms and policies that were there to support women. They also dismantled the Human Rights Commission of Afghanistan, and instead introduced, for example, Minister of Vice and Virtue, and also Directorate for the monitoring and implementation of these decrees. So seeing this, and then one of the crazy things they did was the divorce cases that was settled in favor of the woman under the previous government. They dismantled all of them, and now women had to go back to their abusive husbands or go back to the houses that they experienced domestic violence. And now there is no system, there is no protection mechanism, and there is no justice system that women can refer to if they are victim of any type of discrimination and violence. Because in Afghanistan, now that discrimination is based, on the basis of law and is systematic, and there are institutions that are implementing it. That's why women inside Afghanistan started calling their experience as gender apartheid, because they see gender apartheid as a framework that can encompass the totality of the crime and atrocities the Taliban are perpetrating against them. So they started between 1996 and 2001, when the Taliban were in control in their first era. Women of Afghanistan, alongside their international allies, were calling that. But then this time, when it happened again, they were like, if it was codified first time, why, would we have to experience this now? So that's why this call actually started coming from the women inside Afghanistan, describing their experience as gender apartheid. And then we had international experts, allies like HITAR, you, and other international organizations, that they were like, okay, if women of Afghanistan are calling for this, how we can then codify it. So the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty is under consideration in the UN Legal Committee, Sixth Committee, which is their legal committee. And then a group of international experts suggested an article that we include gender apartheid to be included as an article within that crime. The definition has been discussed with and consulted with large group of women activists inside and outside Afghanistan. And what we are asking is that gender be included alongside race in the definition of apartheid. So we are not asking for the definition to be changed, but we are just asking that gender be included inside the convention or the definition of apartheid next to race. So that's why I think, to conclude and answer your question, is what's happening in Afghanistan is not just any social or cultural act or any individual or group doing something, but it's law and policy of that regime, because they are a misogynistic group. And then politically, it is existential for them, because if you know Taliban, one of the defining characteristics of their movement is actually misogyny. That's how they train their soldiers, that, that women are source of sin. You should fight against Western countries or against other people inside Afghanistan that believe in freedom of women, and they limit women to childbearers and caregivers that be limited inside the house. And then that's why, for the sustainability of that regime, a community, a country that be able to embrace the Taliban, a space that Taliban can grow, is only possible if everyone else comply with that ideology. So that's why outside the house, they have so now another insane thing that came with the new Minister of Vice and Virtue Regulation was defining muhtasibin, the Taliban soldier, they call them muhtasibin, gave them so much vague power that a Talib on the street, if he deems that my dressing is not proper, for example, he can stop me, make a decision at that moment, punish me, and detain me. So there is no law, there is no due process. But what's happening is that's how they're controlling women in public space. But they also make sure that they control women inside their houses. So what happens, they're putting men in charge. By the law says, if a woman is out without a male chaperone, or if she is not dressed properly, or if she is not abiding by any of these decrees that they have issued, it will be men in the family. It can be father, brother, husband, that will be subject to first 3 days of imprisonment, and it can be prolonged in case, the muhtasib or the Taliban soldier, as he deems necessary. So now, for example, if I'm sick, I'm a woman from Afghanistan. If I'm living inside Afghanistan, if I'm sick, I need to go to the doctor. Or if my husband has beaten me and I need to take medical care, I cannot go alone. I need to ask my husband to take me. Otherwise, he will be, if I'm alone outside, yeah, they detain me, but they're all gonna also torture or detain or punish the man in the family. So automatically it gives control of an authority to the man to control women inside the house too. So they are controlling the private space and also the public space. And one important aspect of this is, so with this level of oppression inside Afghanistan, there is no way, there is no process or justice system that women can actually refer to. That's one thing. And there is no way for them to, their freedom of movement is controlled. They cannot go to work, they cannot go to school, and there is really hard for the women inside Afghanistan to congregate. That's why a framework like gender apartheid and its codification legally is very important, that it can create a broader global solidarity for women in Afghanistan, and it also allow us to activate international legal mechanisms, because we cannot do much inside Afghanistan. Women of Afghanistan do, for example, we had a protest today on the streets. So when they, make a voice, it has to be amplified and supported outside the country. And then for the justice system and keeping the Taliban accountable, or making sure that they do not get recognized or their actions against women do not get normalized, we have to rely on international laws. Because now, yes, one thing for me is important to bring accountability for the Taliban, but also it's more important that we ensure accountability for international community on how they engage, how they normalize, or how they approach the Taliban. So that's why women of Afghanistan believe gender apartheid can give them that framework to bring accountability both for the Taliban, but also for international community on how they engage and approach case of Afghanistan.
Thank you, Mitra. And I think that you have laid out the case really, really well in terms of why this is needed as a legal international tool, because the definition of a crime that we do have at our disposal that is also being discussed is, of course, gender persecution. That does exist under international law, but I think that is very different in terms of gender persecution happening at an individual level versus this picture that you're painting about the totality of a system that is based upon the oppression of women as a way of governing, as a way of living from the very top of society all the way to what happens behind closed doors and just in the extremely private lives of both men and women as well. So thank you for that context, for that picture. And speaking of international tools that I would argue are inadequate, I do want to bring in the WPS agenda into this discussion and weave it throughout as we go forward, which I think is important for this audience, for this conversation at PeaceCon this week, that as we're stopping to reflect on peace building itself. I think it's important to really note the ways in which the Women, Peace, and Security agenda has failed the women of Afghanistan, and how it was an extremely important test case for after 20 years of engagement of U.S. and international engagement in Afghanistan, and 20 years of the existence of the agenda itself. Why don't we have more success to point to, not only around the world, but then of course there are some successes, of course, but this case of Afghanistan in particular, where the U.S. and the international community was so heavily involved. What happened? What do we have to learn? What were some of the things that were missed as to why even in a U.S. led context where we did have this groundbreaking legislation of the Women, Peace, and Security Act based on the UNSCR 1325. Again, what happened? I think it's a really, really important question to be asking. And then I think there are some things to learn. I think that some of us have been have found it remarkable at the speed at which the gender apartheid movement has really taken off and become very viable and very powerful, both on the political level and the rhetorical level. So are there things that we can learn from that? I'm going to pose that question to both of you. I also have thoughts of my own. But Heather, maybe I'll send it over to you first, just to do a little bit of exploration there.
Yeah, thanks, Teresa, and good to be here with all of you and with you, Mitra. I guess I was thinking while you were talking about the kind of days that I spent in Kabul, like first working for the UN for the first 4 years that I was there, and going to lots of diplomatic meetings and so on, and how the effort. I mean, I think Afghanistan is kind of a 3-part story in about what happens when you ignore 1325, Security Council Resolution 1325, obviously, and I think back in 2011, 2012, 2013, you already saw this that was sort of the early days of thoughts about negotiations with the Taliban. And you saw Afghan women sort of starting in that moment saying, we have to be at the table. We have to be there. We have to be part of this. And you saw, Afghanistan's presidents, first Karzai and then Ashraf Ghani, both being really incredibly dismissive of those demands, really ignoring women, shutting them out. And so I think, women then went to the diplomatic community, the international community, who were in Kabul at that time and who were essentially paying almost the entire bill for the operating of the Afghan government. The Afghan government was completely sort of beholden to international funding, international support, the international military. And so, if anyone's ever had leverage over a government, it was in that moment. And yet what we saw when women went to those ambassadors and said, look, we're being shut out of this peace process. We need you to insist on us being included, is that those ambassadors shut the door in their faces too. It's worth mentioning, of course, that those ambassadors were almost entirely men. It's worth mentioning that, when the ambassador went to meet with the president or went to meet with the minister, the top 5 things on the list on the agenda for the meeting were about security. And they would never get to the point of talking about women's participation, because to them, that wasn't part of security. That wasn't part of their actual concerns. So that went along for years. I think we had like some tiny gestures when Ghani took over from Karzai toward being a little bit better, but it never really turned into anything more than a kind of token presence. And then that brought us up, of course, to the point where the US was negotiating in Doha with the Taliban. And I think that the fact that Afghan women had been shut out for all those years made it seem very normal to the US that they'd be there in a room with the Taliban and there wouldn't be any Afghan women there, and no one would even be talking about the rights of Afghan women, except occasionally in passing in this incredibly superficial way, this superficial way where the Taliban would sort of show up and say, yeah, sure, of course, women's rights, definitely. And the diplomats would all go, oh, phew, like moving on then, we've dealt with that issue. And then you end up with a deal, which, there isn't a single Afghan woman I've ever met who believed any of those promises that the Taliban made in Doha. But U.S. diplomats were perfectly happy to believe them because they weren't interested in women's rights anyway. We had Zalmay Khalilzad, who was the special envoy for the United States, who was running those negotiations for the U.S. And, when he was asked on occasion about women's rights, and he was incredibly dismissive. He'd sort of say, well, that's a domestic issue for the Afghans, or that's an issue they can talk about in the intra-Afghan dialogue, which was this idea that the US, this kind of fairy tale that the US told about how after they'd cut their deal with the Taliban, then there was going to be some negotiation between Afghans, sort of ignoring the fact that at that point all leverage would be gone and they would have completely sort of discredited the Afghan government anyway by having shut them out of the negotiation that really mattered. So then we have this situation now, which Mitra's described, which is without question the most serious women's rights crisis on the planet, which I think has been created by, in part at least, by ignoring 1325. And what do you do in that moment where you suddenly have the most serious women's rights crisis on the planet that you've created by ignoring women's participation? You'd think, okay, this will be the moment when they finally learn, when they finally realize that that they can't move forward without actually being true to 1325 and having women at the table as full participants, part of the discussion. But I don't think it'll surprise anyone in this room to hear that that's not happening now either. And in fact, it's the opposite. And what we've just seen about 2 months ago now, less than 2 months ago, a month and a half ago now, is no, I guess it is 2 months, is the Doha 3 meeting where, the UN organized the meeting and actually went backwards from where they had been earlier in terms of, what happened with the Doha. So this is the Doha process, which is this process that the UN is leading, which is supposed to try and, sort of address the concerns about the situation in Afghanistan. What happened at the Doha 3 meeting is that they really felt that they needed the Taliban to attend the meeting. the Taliban were invited to the second meeting but declined to attend. And I think the UN was getting a lot of pressure from diplomats who were saying, if the Taliban isn't there at the table, we don't see the point of this process. And so the UN, desperate to seem like, they can deliver and they're in control and whatever, seems to have gone to the Taliban and said, what do we need to do to get you here? And what the Taliban said is no women, no Afghan women in that room, and no human rights on the agenda. And the UN said, sure, let's do that then. And I don't think it's a coincidence that in the weeks after that meeting, which was held with no Afghan women in the room and no human rights on the agenda, we've seen the Taliban looking more emboldened than ever before. They've passed this new declaration that Mitra described. They've also barred the UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in Afghanistan from entering the country. These are pretty bold new moves on their part, and I don't think they would have done that without the lesson that they took away from Doha 3, which is that they've got the international community wrapped around their finger and they can do whatever they like. So I'll stop there, but I feel like for people who kind of watch WPS issues globally, Afghanistan has to look like kind of the worst example of how badly the world can get it wrong and is continuing to get it wrong, even after having seen how devastating that the past mistakes have been. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely, Heather. Completely agree. And to add just a couple of thoughts to that as well is, and you touched on this a few times as you were describing so well the kind of sequence of events that led us to where we are now politically, is that I think that one of the biggest disconnects that happened was, really what is supposed to be at the heart of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, which is the fact that women's rights and the very definition of peace and the very definition of security are not actually separate in reality. That when we treat them as such, that we cannot move forward towards true stability and peace in a way that also reflects justice and freedom for half of humanity. And I think that, as you say, that that women are still being treated as a sideshow, as a special interest group that is rather niche and fringe, as opposed to, again, half of humanity whose lives affect the whole of humanity. And we see that playing out even up until this very moment, where we have a rhetoric that's being repeated by the highest levels of leadership, including the UN Secretary General himself, that Afghanistan is somehow more peaceful, more stable, more secure than it was 5 years ago under the Republic. And maybe that can be justified if you are defining peace and security as bombs not going off in the street, of bombs not falling from the sky. But of course, we have the main group that was perpetrating that actual violence in control now. So as a matter of course, that those there's less incentive to implement that kind of violence. But now we've taken all of that violence and just put it on the backs of women and sent it indoors instead of out in the street. And we're not asking the question, who is more peaceful? Who is more secure? Whose lives are more stable in this current situation? And to have, almost 25 years now, the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, who is trying to change that definition of what peace and security means, that I would see as something that we have failed to fully internalize as we are defining what peace and security even mean. And I think also, too, we need to not just say half of the population. I think if we take all of women and girls, then plus ethnic minorities, musicians, anybody who used to work for the former government, anybody who is a dissenter, then we have actually more than half the population. We have a majority of the Afghan population that is absolutely not more secure, more peaceful, or more stable in their lives than they were. So, and that's where I will bring us to back to the movement to codify gender apartheid, because yes, it's powerful on the legal side, but also the rhetorical side. The Women, Peace, and Security agenda is I think it's highly technical, and doesn't necessarily explain itself. Gender apartheid, the second that you say it, it's punchy, and it automatically creates a tone that says what is happening is unacceptable, and is easily understood on its face of, again, the system-wide societal system of oppression. And so again, there's the legal mechanism of what we're trying to accomplish in terms of making it a crime under international law, but the rhetorical piece of the way it explains the situation and then automatically demands accountability, I think is something that the WPS community not only should get behind, but also learn from. Did you want to add any thoughts on that piece particularly, Mitra, before we move on? Because we can also take questions from the audience about that once we kind of wrap up.
Yes. I think it's also important, as you said before, for women of Afghanistan, that they see all existing mechanisms as complementary to each other. That being said, gender apartheid, WPS, ICC, and ICJ, and other existing mechanisms. The reason is, when we, especially for the codification of gender apartheid, for example, yes, there is a legal aspect of it, and the consequences that it brings, but it also creates the stigma and shame around it. It creates an ethical and moral responsibility that even people, when they engage, for example, in Doha, 25 special envoys from different countries, from the region and international community and Western countries, and in countries with feminist foreign policy, they went there totally ignoring their feminist foreign policy in WPS, regardless of other things. But the understanding is so that's why, as an advocate, for me, it's so important that I do, we socialize the term gender apartheid. Yes, it criminalizes what's happening, but it also, that pinch you said, that brings a lot of other things with it, including global solidarity and ethical and moral responsibility that we then have to, I think they strengthen each other. For example, then they have to be very considerate of WPS action plan that they have in their own countries when they engage in Doha. That's my understanding. Or for the ICC, I think it also emboldened their investigation to go faster. That has been unfortunately very slow for the case of Afghanistan, or more important, for the documentation. I think there is willingness that people do it, but there is no funding. So hopefully it also, can encourage other countries to, give more money to this responsible organizations. It can be human rights organizations to do more work there. So I see them very complementary to each other. If gender apartheid is codified, it also then create some obligations for different countries to be more careful on their WPS action plan and obligations when they engage in case of Afghanistan. And honestly, the situation is so bad that one measurement or one mechanism not going to be responsive to the case of Afghanistan. So that's why I'm like, we need to embolden all of them, or if something like gender apartheid has the capacity and potential that can be strengthened and emboldened and create more solidarity and be received more, we need to push that, but also that can help, for example, other authorities to be more proactive and responsive towards other obligations they have, that WPS can be one of them, definitely.
That's super helpful, Mitra. Thank you so much. And so let's talk about then, how do we use these tools to hopefully impact the situation, to support Afghan women and girls, and just amplify their voices even more, especially now that they're fully banned. Heather, I'm going to turn it over to you. You were mentioning Doha process in terms of essentially the Taliban getting everything that they wanted, that they asked for in order to show up at the table, and then really being given this message that that they can act with impunity. So how do we engage with the Taliban, as the de facto authorities, without legitimizing them, without sending them the message that they can act with impunity? I do think it'd be very difficult to walk back now, but of course we have to continue trying. And how do we engage with also making sure that Afghan women's voices are at the table, are how do we change course, I guess, is the question. And then, are there any examples of engagement that are working? What leverage points exist?
Yeah, thank you, Teresa. So, I think that right after the Taliban takeover, we heard a lot of sort of statements from diplomats that I would describe as magical thinking. There was a lot of discussion about, like, first of all, people were saying, well, it's not the same Taliban. This is the Taliban 2.0. They're really different, like they've made these promises in Doha. They made those promises again they held a press conference on August 17th. After they'd seized power on August 15th. And in that press conference, again, they said, like men and women are equal and women can study and women can work, all of these things. And they began breaking those promises, the next day, which was the day when they banned women from appearing on the national television station. And then it went on from there. And within weeks, they banned secondary education and so on and so forth. But diplomats were still saying then, and some of them are still saying now, well, look, we just have to talk to them, like we have to raise women's rights in all of our discussions with them. We have to try and get Muslim majority countries to talk to them. We have to get the OIC to talk to them. These are the voices that they're really going to listen to, and here we are more than 3 years down the track, and none of those efforts have made any difference. I think that there's no evidence at all that anyone talking to the Taliban, trying to like put pressure on them through meetings, has had any impact. It doesn't matter what religion the people are who are talking to them about women's rights. They don't seem to care. They seem very confident that they're the only ones. If they're the only ones in the world who think that their religion requires them to treat women and girls in this way, then that in their minds is because they're the only ones who understand their religion and everyone else has it wrong. We also have seen lots of diplomatic statements, and I don't want to make it sound like those are useless. They're certainly better than nothing. We saw a statement a couple of days ago from 13 of the members of the Security Council, except for Russia and China, who seem very committed to doing whatever they can to help the Taliban. But so we see these statements, and they're good in terms of continuing to communicate to the Taliban that their behavior is unacceptable. But what would really communicate to the Taliban that their behavior is unacceptable is taking legal steps to hold them accountable. And that's where I think that's where Afghan women's rights defenders have been asking the international community to go for the last at least year or longer, honestly. And I think, sorry, if somebody could just mute. Gerard Fontaine?
Ah oui. Il descend
Can I
bien.
just ask?
Natasha, can you mute Gerard?
Yes, I'm about to go mute. Sorry.
Ah oui.
Thank you.
On va boire comme ça.
Sorry, everyone.
Sorry.
There we go.
Thanks a lot, Natasha. So there are options for ways that the international community can actually take legal action against the Taliban. What's missing is not options. What's missing is political will. So Mitra has talked about one option, which is a really important one, which is trying to change international law to add gender apartheid through this new treaty that's being debated at the UN General Assembly. It's a treaty on crimes against humanity. And there's a very important moment coming up on that treaty in early October when states will decide whether to move it into the negotiation phase. And if it moves forward into the negotiation phase, then that means that, you know, by the end of this year, there could be like a real discussion going on about potential amendments to that treaty. So that would be important, but that's not the only option. Mitra has also mentioned the International Criminal Court. The states that are members of the International Criminal Court should be asking the court why it's taking so long, like why there haven't been any charges brought, why there haven't been any arrest warrants issued for Taliban leaders, bringing cases against them for the crime of gender persecution, which is a crime under the Rome Statute and which they are very clearly committing. So that's one option. Another one is the International Court of Justice. Under the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, if you have a look, scroll way down to the bottom, and the second to the last article says that the International Court of Justice can hear disputes between different states over interpretation of the treaty. And what that means in practice is that there are 149 different countries that could, one on their own or several states together, bring a case against Afghanistan about the Taliban's violations of CEDAW. You know, would that change? Would any of these options change anything overnight? No, but I think we've all seen, for example, you know, the way that the case that South Africa brought against Israel, you know, earlier this year or at the end of last year has actually changed some of the discussion around the violence that's happening in Gaza. And so it's worth thinking about how a case like that could change the discussion about Afghanistan, could change the willingness that we're seeing by the international community to accept and normalize the Taliban's behavior. One other mechanism that I'll mention is, you know, all of these other strategies, the ICC, the ICJ, gender apartheid, they all depend on you having evidence about what's happening in Afghanistan. And right now, no one's collecting that evidence in a systematic and thorough way. There isn't a body that has that mandate and has those resources. And so one of the things that my organization and a lot of other Afghan international human rights organizations have been pushing for is for the Human Rights Council to set up a new UN mandated mechanism to collect and preserve evidence of crimes committed in Afghanistan. So those are kind of the big sort of legal mechanisms, but there's one more thing I want to mention, which is the 1951 Refugees Convention. You know, after the Taliban took over in August 2021, we saw this kind of flurry of activity by countries, particularly ones that had been very actively involved in the war, to evacuate some Afghans, you know, with a focus on people like military interpreters who, you know, were going to be at risk because of their work for foreign governments. But there's a feeling now, and has been for several years, that's over now, that everyone's moved on. And in fact, what's happening is that as the crackdown on women and girls intensifies every day, there's a steady stream of women and girls who are deciding that they can't live in Afghanistan, that it's not possible. And you see that coming out in increasing suicide rates, which is devastating, but you also see it in terms of people fleeing. And under the 1951 Refugee Convention, we need to be seeing a lot. We need to be seeing countries all over the world, particularly the ones who were so involved in the conflict over those 20 years, not just letting women resettle if they make it to their country, but also creating pathways so that women and girls who need to flee, women and girls who've already fled but haven't been able to make it further than, for example, Pakistan and Iran, have a way to actually move forward and get to safety and resettle. And that really doesn't exist at this moment at all. And it's the very, very least that countries could be doing.
Absolutely. Pushing for those pathways has also been an uphill battle, of course, given all of this. Mitra, same question to you, just quickly in terms of actually using the tools that are at our disposal, as well as if you have any thoughts on, what engagement can or should look like in a way that could possibly be meaningful.
Thank you. In addition to everything Heather says, echoing that, I think one more important thing is for this, advocacy for all these mechanisms are important, and it's also key that the voices that are coming from inside be supported and emboldened. And that's only possible if we ensure that the civil society organizations, the women-led nonprofit organizations that were active in Afghanistan before and are still trying to be active and operate, receive enough financial support and funding. So one way is how we can make sure, so different countries are trying to support Afghanistan, and they have, of course, financial budget for the country, but how we make sure that that the funds that goes to Afghanistan actually do support women-led organizations. And my approach is, even if we do not, even if the women-led organizations cannot do the public advocacy and civil society activities that we are used to, that we know of, it's okay. As long as they can operate, they can engage in underground school activities they can engage in humanitarian aid distributions they have. I think that's one important thing. And the second one is, honestly, I'm in awe of the courage and also the creativity in the ways that women inside Afghanistan adapt with changing circumstances. How we can make sure in our advocacy, in our engagements, that the international community ensure that they allow the women of Afghanistan to navigate their own ways internally and do not limit them to the strict administrative, rules and regulations that were already in place before the Taliban came, in terms of reporting, in terms of how they operate, in terms of, for example, sending pictures from their activities. So I think how we can ensure that we give the space for women of Afghanistan and listen to them on how they want to navigate their own ways inside Afghanistan and still keep them supported. That's one thing. The second thing is humanitarian aid is a big thing for Afghanistan. But it's not. There is no mechanism in place to monitor it if it's gender sensitive. And women, we have we are a country with a protracted war history of more than 50 years or 45 years. We have we are one of the countries with a very large widow community where women are head of households. What happens is now women don't have the freedom of movement. They cannot go out. We are the distribution centers for humanitarian aid is mainly mosques and community centers. They cannot go there. Female aid workers are not allowed. So now even women even cannot work with the UN as humanitarian aid workers. So that has restricted women's access to humanitarian aid, what they really need. So how we make sure that we ask UN on how they distribute the humanitarian aid, how they send the money to Afghanistan is principled. And by principled, we mean, UN knows what principled engagement is. It's not that they don't have it within their own regulations. So that's I think the second most important thing is for me is humanitarian aid, because the money they are sending to Afghanistan is not, for example, food items or anything. It's like the cash money. They send around 80 million or sometimes 40 million bi-weekly to the Taliban. And that has psychologically embolden the Taliban regime too, because the aid only goes to the people who fight for them, their soldiers, and also they take pictures and publish it. You know, how we can, instead of we supporting women psychologically, this has impacted them very negatively, because they're like, okay, I think we need to know the context of Afghanistan. Psychologically, if you see our modern history, it has been external interventions, and then there has been fight, they get out and another one come. If it was British and Russian and then Americans. So people psychologically believe any system, any regime that has, you know, an external great power backup, somehow they're gonna win. And in this fight, with this $40 million cash biweekly going to the Taliban, they're taking the pictures and posting it in their media. And then we don't see that much support for the women protesters group. We see it from human rights organizations, from activists, but not that much from the government officials, and honestly, not much from the diplomats who work as ambassadors or special envoys on behalf of these countries towards Afghanistan. We don't see, you know, an equal support in the public space. So that has also psychologically, you know, create this disappointment for the women protesters who take risk, go to streets to resist against the Taliban. That's another. And then last thing that I want to emphasize is what happened beyond 2021. The only strong resistance force against the Taliban were women. When they went to the streets, they faced gunshots, imprisonment, tortures. They killed these women, but still they resisted. Yes, we have the military resistance too. I respect them. Good. And then we need multiple front resistance inside Afghanistan if they want to resist militarily or in civic way. That's valid, and I respect them. I don't want to, you know, question any resistance inside Afghanistan. But the only difference is this international community does not recognize the political legitimacy and agency of women in Afghanistan. They still see them and limit them for the women's right, or maybe, you know, few women protest. Well, they are the actual resistance inside Afghanistan. But when Doha happens or another international engagement happens, they don't ask them, human rights organizations ask them to speak. But when you see meetings happening in Norway, in Vienna, in Doha, they don't bring them on that table as a political force who can be an alternative for the Taliban. So when you speak with diplomats, they're like, oh, there is no other alternative to the Taliban inside Afghanistan. So let's engage with them. Let's continue working with them while they keep failing us, while they keep lying to us. And then there is like thousands of women resisting on the streets of Kabul. They're killing them, but no one see them as a political agent that can sit on the other side of the table with the Taliban and negotiate. Even if they ask us to go, they're like, oh, you are a member of civil society and you're limited to speak about women's rights. So they so much distract women's rights from the actual political and other issues that's happening in Afghanistan, from the security, from humanitarian aid, from everything. So is the world actually limiting the voices of women of Afghanistan and only loves to see them as victims, while I'm like, they are on the streets without gun fighting a regime, you know, that we know as a terrorist and have so much weapons and guns from themselves and what left from the US Army inside Afghanistan. So I think the other important thing is how we can make sure that we advocate and speak about recognition of political agency of women resistance inside Afghanistan.
That's super helpful, Mitra. And I think that leads us right into our last question that we can talk about rather quickly. And then we really want to get to questions from the audience and have a little bit more of a discussion. But I think it's the point that you just raised is a really, really important one, and a question that's kind of been circling because there's this you know, or at least what's pointed to as a disconnect between Afghan women who are outside the country, who are rightly advocating, and then women who are inside the country still advocating, still protesting, as you're talking about, Mitra, and doing everything that they can, but are being increasingly silenced, increasingly subject to arrest, detention, torture, and then of course women who are just trying to leave the country. As Heather said, they're simply not a way to live. But of course, the entire population of women is not going to leave. How do we stay in touch with them? How do we continue to amplify their voices? How do we make sure that this global movement to codify gender apartheid continues to be informed by their lived experience on the ground? Of course, we have technology to stay in touch, but even that becomes increasingly dangerous in this environment. So Mitra, given your own activism, and then Heather, given your experience of years living in the country, I'd like both of you to weigh in on that before we turn it over to the audience. Whoever would like to start and go first.
Okay, I go first then. So I think to be brief, just we need to listen to the women of Afghanistan and I rely on their instructions, because they are navigating their own ways and adapting every day. And if they are comfortable, they will come and talk to you over the signal. They can't tell you when they want to talk to you. But the only thing is, we shouldn't excuse ourselves and be like, okay, I don't engage with women inside Afghanistan because I don't want to put them at risk. The thing is, they are already at risk. We shouldn't be the ones to determine if we give her, that agency or not. By not engaging with them, I think we take away their agency. They are on the streets, they are putting themselves at risk, they are, experiencing imprisonment. And even if they are not in the prison of the Taliban, they are imprisoned inside their houses. If they are asking us to become an ally for them, amplify their voices and hear them, I think we should. I am one of the people who don't believe, I see this an excuse a lot from different organizations. Sometimes they're like, oh, we don't want to put women inside Afghanistan at risk. I'm like, listen to her. She will tell you how to not put her at risk. But if she is already taking the risk, our responsibility is ask her, how can I help? Do you need financial help? Do you need money to get a safe phone that is not trackable? Do you need me to provide you with some tech trainings or apps that cannot be filtered? So I think the question we need to ask is how we can make our engagement more secure with the women of Afghanistan, instead of like, let's not engage at all.
Absolutely. Great points and very practical. Heather, over to you.
Yeah, I'll just add that that there's some really helpful information that we have, not just from individual women, but UN Women has been doing something really valuable, which is doing a quarterly survey of Afghan women across most of the provinces in the country. That survey is implemented by an Afghan NGO, which is called DROPS. And the findings are really important. They say that, women are incredibly critical of the Taliban. They're incredibly sort of despairing about the situation that they're in. The term gender apartheid resonates with a majority of them, and and they say that they want a majority of women say they want the international community to use that term. And I think that those surveys really kind of demolish this myth that we hear a lot from diplomats, where they sort of try to discredit the voices of women in the diaspora by saying, oh, your perspective is totally different from that of women inside the country. And, they try to sort of say that, it's this kind of catch-22 where they say, well, you can't talk to women inside the country because it's not safe for them, but there's no point in talking to women outside the country because they have a totally different perspective. And the research from UN Women tells us exactly the opposite. So I would really recommend anyone to have a look at that research. And I think someone's just put it in the chat. Thank you so much for that.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. I think we've really raised some important points here about, what can be done. And again, just really practical and actionable ideas. So we have about 9 minutes left. We would love to hear from or even see some of our audience members. If you have questions about anything that has come up, we would absolutely love to hear from you. And maybe we could use the hand raising function as a way to start. Nisha, I'm going to put you on the spot. Oh, there you are. Go ahead and jump on in. Thank you for raising your hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to give space to others, but just thank you so much for this wonderful discussion. You've raised so many important points, and also I think sentiments for those of us who do work on this, that, you know, what does it mean to learn to not just be, you know, I don't know how many times I've written the phrase, like, you know, the WPS agenda, which has completely failed the women of Afghanistan, and so to come out of it with the idea that we can learn some lessons is, you know, is of course really powerful and important. And I'm just wondering what kind of, where we're in this global moment as well, where gender backlash is growing, and there are, you know, I think that the movement for gender apartheid has been, it's been applicable to Afghanistan, but we know that other movements have also been, other women's rights movements have been supportive of it. And I'm just curious what kind of, whether you all think that there's strength in perhaps identifying its applicability beyond Afghanistan, and whether that has been useful or just like complicating matters, for just to be frank, like this is an informal discussion. And also just, we're also learning about some of the way, you know, we're seeing mistakes repeat themselves in other conflicts, like Sudan, particularly where the WPS agenda is not being, you know, applied in its full form. You know, it's being sort of, again, we're hearing the same arguments like, well, not right now, or, you know, here's an opportunity on the sidelines. So I'm just wondering, I guess, both, how are you seeing this connected with other women's rights movements, and has that been positive, or has it come with its own challenges? And then, you know, if there are takeaways, like, for what we should be doing differently with the conflicts we're seeing now to sort of avoid repeating those mistakes, you know, what would those takeaways be for those attending who might be working, you know, on a broader portfolio?
Do either of you want to go ahead and jump in? Heather, Mitra?
Mitra, I wondered if maybe, do you want to talk about your discussions in South Africa? I feel like that might be interesting for people.
Yeah. So there is a, you know, a regress on women's rights and gender justice internationally, and but even the gender apartheid campaign in gender apartheid today is a coalition of women, Afghan and Iranian women, because some of the Iranian women also describe their experience as gender apartheid, because certain restrictions and control mechanisms that are applied by the Iranian government is also based in law, and it's institutionalized and systematic. But then I think we in my recent trip that I had to South Africa, where we engaged with different people from you know, the legal community, the government, civil society, women activists, because for us it was important. For women of Afghanistan, they resonate with apartheid because they see it as, you know, that it can encompass the totalizing nature of what the atrocities happening. It's not, you know, one single limitations or ban, but it's almost every single right. And it was really, I think, heartwarming to see how or the responses or the reaction we received from women in South Africa, that they that they were concerned about what's happened in Afghanistan, but they also understood it. And also it was really nice to you know, to see this conversation about women in South Africa saying how impact of apartheid even then was disproportionate on women, and still women in South Africa's experiencing the consequences of the apartheid regime. It was of course applied on all the people in South Africa, Black people, on the basis of race, but you know, the layers were different. It was disproportionate on women there. So I think having that solidarity is also helpful, but also it can the threshold for gender apartheid is very, very high. And I think the conversation it creates a global community, at least among legal experts in New York that that represent different countries, has the potential to embolden this gender justice conversation overall. But the good thing about the campaign is most of the countries, for example, who have endorsed the gender apartheid codification is not all Western liberal countries. We have, for example, Mexico and Malta and Philippines and Chile that have been very, very supportive in actually leading this effort at legal front. And even for the South Asian countries, there is a regional network of Pakistan, India, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh, and some other countries. No, we haven't heard anything from their government. Make sure that I say that regional network has been very vocal. The regional network consists of women activists from those countries that are working on gender justice. There is a very strong conversation down there among those groups. And even when I was in June, when I was in Geneva for the Human Rights Council, one of the panels that Heather and I spoke on it too was actually co-hosted by that South Asia Regional Network. So I think that the global solidarity is there, and then different coalitions and different civil society groups are coming together to show that solidarity. Italian Parliament, I had a visit on July, and then they promised us to have a hearing. Actually, yesterday they had a hearing on gender apartheid. French Parliament had a discussion on gender apartheid with one of our activists actually today, this morning. So, and then Albania showed the support. We had something on Canadian. My colleagues also, that John will be speaking with New Zealand. So there is, I think, there is governments that there is some reluctance maybe, but the good thing is the civil society from different countries has been very vocal and supportive in this regard. But I think for me personally is important that, if the call comes from civil society, it should come from South Africa, because there isn't it better in recognizing and respecting their experience and legacy that gonna also create a hope for the women inside Afghanistan. Because what we heard in our meetings in South Africa was, because of that level of oppression, support from outside was key. And that's true for women of Afghanistan too. After 3 years, it's very hard, to keep that hope alive. And I think hearing from experience of women in South Africa can, I think support the perseverance of women inside Afghanistan to continue resisting against it.
I think that's a really good place to end actually our conversation on a note of hope that we all know to be so incredibly powerful in sustaining movements when things feel hopeless, in keeping us going and building international solidarity, maintaining pressure, maintaining energy as we push forward under the circumstances that Afghan women are facing that are so incredibly dire. So if there's one key takeaway from what this gender apartheid movement, the movement to push for it to be codified, is adding to the world, I hope it'd certainly be a great one. Mitra, I know that you need to go soon, but Heather or Mitra yourself, any closing thoughts or parting words that we want to leave our audience with?
No, just thank you for showing up. Thank you for being interested in this topic at a moment where it feels quite forgotten. Thank you.
Absolutely. And please don't hesitate to get in touch with any of us. And I think our contact information is in the PeaceCon panel, but Mitra, go ahead.
Just wanted to say thank you and for their patience to hear us. The only thing I want to leave this discussion is every voice matters for Afghanistan. So no one should feel what they do, what they say, or even a single tweet is less. I think it adds to that momentum that we need.
Absolutely. With that, we will say goodbye. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. I hope the rest of the conference goes really well, and please don't hesitate to be in touch. Thank you so much to Heather and Mitra.